Hello. So, this is the next live, the new setup for the live with which I'll be working on today. This illustration. So I'm just checking out um, if we're transmitting well to YouTube, which we are, with sound and everything. And now I have to just copy this into the Artist Valley website. And let's see if we now appear. That seems about right. Let me just see if there's any sound. Yes, there is sound. Great. Okay, wonderful. So this is my Saturday night live where I'll be working on watercolors with this piece that is already done, but I think it needs more shadowing and to punch up the difference in values. So I've got everything drawn, laid out, and I've got the inks already in place. But really, I think it needs more weight and possibly a bit more texture. So first off, I thought I'd work in with a watercolor pencil. See if there are places I can go to make this more interesting and make it pop a bit more. Now this is the pencil is very dark, but as it's a watercolor pencil, I'll probably be able to lighten it down slightly with the watercolors. Now watercolors, working with watercolors is something quite new, quite recent for me. I mean, I've dabbled with colors before, be it gouache, watercolor, um, even acrylics and oil painting. But really, it's never been much of my thing. I really like black and white artwork. But I have been exploring watercolors over the last couple of years, so much so that in my latest project, 10 Lost Days, there is always at least one watercolor page in the story, hopefully in an organic way that makes sense. But I devised the story so that this was possible, and hopefully makes the story more interesting. And that's normally most of the reasoning behind page layouts and style choices. And so exploring watercolors is probably part of getting back into inks and brush, which, as I have mentioned, um, for about 10 years I was doing just digital artwork or digital inking, but I was missing drawing on paper and getting my fingers dirty. And this time around, because I started out drawing comics with pen and ink, but this time I decided to go more with a brush and explore the brush in other ways, such as watercolor. And I did a few classes with some incredible professionals here in São Paulo, and one of these classes was actually with if I'm not wrong, a Mexican guy, and he pointed out, it was new to me. He said watercolors, it has the name watercolors for a reason. It's because of the water. Let the water act on paper. Let the water take control. Let the water take you places that you didn't imagine, that you didn't foresee. And I thought that was very interesting because up until that point, I had focused much more on the color part of the name, and I thought that the water was just a way of managing the color, putting the color to paper. But actually, he pointed out that the whole, the fun with watercolor is the water, and the things that the water does on the paper, that sometimes you can't even control, depending on the amount of water that you put on the paper. It might have completely unexpected results. So I've been exploring that idea lately, but also trying to find the balance between the control that you can get with a pencil, a pen, and a quite a dry brush, or what you can get with something uncontrollable that will act on its own accord on the paper. Personally, I think that if we stop exploring, if we stop learning, we get stale. And there are always new techniques. There are always new things to learn, new artists to study. Sometimes not even new in the sense that, they're recent. I mean, technology is recent, Photoshop and 3D and other things. But sometimes new is just an artist, a 200-year-old artist that you had never heard before. So it's new to you. And sometimes their technique, even though it's 200 years old, is fascinating. So this piece of art, this drawing, this is a character, and there are two companions here, a lion and a tiger. Now I probably will punch up much more the dark areas in the character, and not so much with the characters. I want him to pop out more on the page than the animals, but still they're very light at the moment, so I will work on them a bit. Something else that I've found very interesting about working traditionally, or getting back into working traditionally, is I'm reminded of how much patience we actually have to have working on the computer. There are so many things that are lightning fast, and there's the undo button, and there are layers. So there are many incredible resources to speed up the work mostly. Um, there are new effects, there are different effects, but a lot of the resources that we find on the computer are to make the work quicker. Now, when you're working with brush and paper and water, there's the time of the media that you're working with. The medium is, what how long does it take for the water to set or dry, and if you have to work in a certain direction, and if you want the flow to go in one way or another, so there's a time that is very different when you're working on paper, and I find it refreshing in the sense that I have to often slow myself down. And I've seen this with other artists and students. We want the artwork to be ready, like as soon as possible. We have this idea in our head, and let's get it out there uh, as soon as possible. And um, often it's just not that fast. Sometimes it will take 8 hours, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more. Fortunately, this piece is, I've already spent 8 hours on this piece, so we don't actually have to wait 8 hours to see it ready. I might not even finish it in this half hour that I've given myself for this live today, but we'll definitely see it advance. Watercolor pencils, it's new to me. I've used it once or twice only before, and of course it's almost as soft as a charcoal pencil, probably more like an 8B, a 9B pencil. So I'm not trying to get too fine a point here. But it is interesting to see how much of this will dissolve with water. I know from a couple of drawings that I have done that it doesn't dissolve everything, just a small part actually. So we'll still see these lines in the finished piece. Just the tiger left to do. Now it has lost quite a bit of the point we had at the beginning. Just going to sharpen it a bit. Okay. Something I recommend to my students, and I follow myself, is that I'll always do the layout for a page or an illustration off the top of my head, following uh, whatever is needed in the piece or whatever my intention is or what's being requested. So I'll do the first sketches uh, with no reference, just playing with the layout and which element needs to be where. And then once I'm happy with that, then I'll look for reference for, in this case, the animals in that position uh, that I intend. Sometimes, in this case, somebody wearing a hoodie, but I don't look for reference before I have an idea of what I'm looking for. So So I won't build my layout based on the reference, but I will use reference once the layout is done. Okay, just about done here with a pencil. And now brush and ink, at least brush and water. So I'm mixing here ink and watercolor for the black. So I like to use Talon's ink and watercolors. I've got this Van Gogh black. So what's on the paper already is a mixture of ink and watercolor. I've got a little bit of watercolor here, so I'll be using watercolor. Now, the basic of watercolor is that we go from light to dark. So let's see. And we leave the areas that we want to be white. We leave that shine from the paper itself. Now to make the dark areas darker, I'm also going to have to put in a bit more grey. To bump up the contrast with the white areas. And the other thing about watercolors is that they can be very dark when we're putting them down on paper, but they will lighten up when they dry out. So whatever we see when the paint is wet is going to be lighter when the paper is dry. So as long as you've got a lot of contrast between your whites and your darks, you can put quite a lot of paint onto the paper because it will lighten up. One of the things about working at home in a pandemic, as most people are finding out, myself included, is that having kids around when you're working with, well, when you're working with anything really, but when you're working with paint and ink, it can be incredibly hard and testing. So we might have a visit from my daughter, my 3-year-old, soon to be 3-year-old daughter, at some point during this live presentation. So when you're putting down the water to begin with, even if it's with a little bit of paint, it won't spread out much. But if you've already put the water down on the page and then you put ink, down, it will spread out into the water that you have in that area. And then you get more interesting gradients, and it will spread out in quite unpredictable ways. So that's when you begin to relinquish control to the water and just see where it will take the paint. You do have a window though. You have about 30 seconds maybe at the most, since you put down the water before it dries out, if you're not overloading it too much. So when you put down the water, it will stay on the paper for a few seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds. It depends on the paper that you're using. And in that time, you can throw in more paint and let the water take it. Just like in an ink piece, you have to be very careful with the contrast. You have to have dark areas and light areas. So that it doesn't go too much in either direction. You have to be able to define the form with both. Another thing that I always recommend to my students is choose one light source. Don't make things too complicated for yourself, especially to begin with, but even later. You know, there is one light source for this figure. And it can be a dramatic light source from above or from below. Having one light source doesn't mean that it's boring. It can be incredibly dramatic in space, for example. At least in our solar system, we only have one light source, which is the sun. So when you're out in space, in the Milky Way, near or passing by any planet, absolutely any planet, you'll have one light source. So the shadows will not have a backlight. Inside the ship they will, but outside the ship there's only one. Light is only coming from the sun, and therefore the shadows will be extremely dark and always on the opposite side to wherever the sun is. And you can still get incredibly dramatic scenarios when you're looking out of your spaceship window. So we're about to hit 30-minute mark, which is what I've given myself for this live, as I thought that I'm still going to spend some more time with the animals down here. Basically do the same thing that I've been doing with the character, which is putting more solid blacks and also letting the water take control more often. So if anybody has any questions, I'm just going to have a quick look at the computer, because I'm at the drawing board now and the computer is almost behind me. So there's Giuliano, there's Flavio, and Giuliano and Flavio again. Flavio asks, traditional or digital inking, which are the differences between each method? Well, as I've mentioned, digital is often faster in that you have undos, you have layers, there are more resources in general. Basically, for work purposes, especially if you're working in color, for work purposes, digital is much more practical. You can make changes on the fly. If your editor requests anything, it's much easier to manipulate the image, make color changes, make inking changes, cutting out a figure and pasting in a background or a different background. So digital is incredibly helpful for work purposes, I found. Whereas traditional inking has given me much more pleasure, truth to be told. There is something valuable about understanding an instrument, be it digital or traditional, but in this case it's an instrument that won't let you do undos or many undos, or if there are certain ways that you can maybe undo something that you've done, or reconfigure it in a certain way that it doesn't appear to be an error. So yeah, but there's something about having something physical and ending the day with your fingers dirty, and having a workspace that is organized to let you work enough without impeding the work. Anyway, maybe it's just this time in my life. For 10 years I had great fun with digital inking, but now I'm finding this much more interesting. So I hope this has been helpful or fun to watch. And tomorrow, Sunday, I'll be doing another couple of lives. One for me, in the morning, 11 o'clock, and the other one at the same time as this one, which is 7 o'clock in the evening. Okay. Have a great Comic-Con, and all the best.